Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Apostate of Mind. I'm Mark Peralta, and with me is the lovely Apostate Ann. What's up?
Hey, everyone.
So tell us, Apostate Ann, why are we here today?
Well, if you were raised a Christian, then you probably remember learning because it says in the Bible that Moses was the author of the first 5 books of the Bible. And I remember Mark telling us that he learned in seminary school about a hypothesis called the documentary hypothesis that challenges the idea that Moses is the author. And so that was the first thing that started setting off some questions about the validity of the Bible. So we wanted Mark to share more about that. And first, I wanted to ask you, if Moses isn't the author, what are the implications of that?
Yeah, so if Moses is not the author, then we seriously must question whether or not the Bible was the divinely inspired word of a God, because then somebody is lying. Also, should we really trust the message of the Pentateuch? That message of the law, everything, the commandments, all that stuff. And then finally, Jesus clearly seems to believe that there was a Moses who wrote about him. But if there was no Moses who wrote this, then Jesus was either deceived, he was lying to us, or just simply was ignorant, as any other human being could be about that. So,
yeah, that's huge. I mean, I think about Moses. I mean, he's the character that God had passed down the 10 commandments to. He was the one who shared the creation story. I mean, that's where we get a lot of these stories, we think is from Moses, and him being this godly favored man is what makes the story so credible.
Yeah, the Exodus.
Yes. So
yeah. Which in Christian theology plays a significant role, because it sort of sets like the preamble to spiritual exodus with regards to salvation in the Christian message. So if there was no physical liberation because there was no Moses and no Exodus, then how could there be a spiritual exodus as well?
There's a lot of cards that come falling down in that house of cards there.
Yep.
So now that we know what the implications of that, what is the documentary hypothesis proposing?
Yeah, so the documentary hypothesis posits that the Pentateuch, in other words, the first 5 books of the Bible, were not solely authored by a single individual, but rather a collaboration of multiple unnamed writers, perhaps reflecting slightly different traditions from different places of the nation. And so this is a different setup. It's a different book altogether.
Yeah, you mentioned different traditions. Tell us about the different traditions.
So there are at least 4. First one being the Yahwist, and then you've got the Elohimist tradition, the priestly tradition, and then there's a Deuteronomist tradition. Each tradition came at a different time period. So scholars have theorized that the Yahwist and the Elohist tradition were sort of like were given birth right around the 9th to the 10th century BC. And then later, the Deuteronomist and the priestly tradition in the 6th or 7th century BC came into play, and other things were added, like the book of Deuteronomy and some of the other stuff like Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings as well. So different books, different narratives that are added with the passing of time. The diagram you see there sort of like summarizes how you've got 2, the J and the E source, that are come together as the JE now. And this would have been right around the pre-exilic time, that is right before Jerusalem, or the nation of Judah is taken captive to Babylon, is when the J source and the E source appear to have been put together or compiled together, because at that moment, Israel in the north is already captive. So the Judeans preserve the traditions or the beliefs of the northern Israelites during that time, and so they are harmonized in such a way.
So it is in line with political events that are going on of 2 nations joining, though we see a tradition of these texts or these traditions merging.
Yeah. So and this seems like it is historical fact. When Israel in the north is taken captive, Jerusalem, Judah remains. That's when that's preserved. And then other things are added, other traditions come into play while they're in exile in Babylon. I think that's when you start learning about like different cosmologies or perspectives of how the world was created, that started with the Babylonians in that region of the world. And so they adopt some of these ancient, more ancient myths, and they include them as part of a redaction. So by the time the Jews return to the land post exile, they've added things, and now they've got four sources or four hands that are at play.
So it sounds like there's some explanations on why we're seeing these different traditions. So what makes each tradition distinct from the other?
Yeah, so it's kind of complex. It does involve many factors. One easy factor is, okay, sorry, the slides are going crazy. One easy factor is the use of the name Yahweh in place of Elohim, or in place of El Shaddai or El, which are each distinct names for God. Yep. And so, but that's not all. So the J source will talk about God in terms of from the perspective of man. So the Yahwist source understands God to be one that could approach you personally, who could talk to you. So there you have Abraham sharing a meal with Yahweh. You've got Yahweh walking in the garden with Adam and Eve in that creation story.
So you can't even say like, oh, God has many names. Here we're using one name, you're using another. No, that what comes along with it is even just a different depiction of what God or who God is.
Oh yeah, that whole God, different names for God is ridiculous. So there's Yahweh is a God, El is another God, but over time these things sort of became synonymized, if you will. And so now they try to explain those things away. But it's pretty clear that there are distinct names, and each tradition it's exclusive of that usage of name.
And what if someone were to say, well, maybe it's just the different aspects of God. He can be personal God and he can be, overlooking big picture God.
Yeah, so that's where you get into theological contradictions, because is God one who is omnipresent, meaning he's everywhere, or is he only in one place at a time? So, for example, when you have God approaching Cain and he's like, hey, what have you done with your brother? Is God lying to him? Like, hey, what have you done with him? I know what you've done with him, but you tell me, is he lying, or is he ignorant about the whereabouts of Abel? Right?
Right.
And just the plain fact of being in one place is contradictory to being in all places. If you're in all places at every time, at all times, then you can't be in one place in particular.
Right.
You can't reside inside a temple. You're in and through the temple. So why is there a temple?
So he can't be all the things, because that's contradictory.
That's right. So perhaps you have one tradition that really sees God as omnipresent and doesn't necessarily see the need for a temple. But then you've got other traditions like the priestly tradition that says, no, not only can there only be one temple, but that's the temple has to be in Jerusalem, and that's the only place where God is willing to reside. So it's things like that in Christian theology we just harmonize everything, or if you read the Bible, you just read past through it and you don't really stop and think, well, that seems kind of odd. The Elohimist source has a more abstract perspective on God. It's a God that it's a little more detached, more outside space and time. Unlike the J source, the Elohimist source, God uses a representative. That's where you get that term angel, which simply means messenger. and it's a spokesperson for God because God does not approach people personally. He has to use a messenger. And so you read stuff like that where you're like, wait a minute, why is he using a messenger here? And so that's the Elohim source in a nutshell. It tends to favor the north over the south, which the J source favors. Why? Because it comes from a southern tradition. The E source is more of a northern Israeli, North Israel tradition. And then you've got the D source and the P source that just kind of do very unique things with the text, primarily adding more stuff like laws, like censuses, genealogies, and things like that. But they also get into things like what's the best way to do this, and cultic practices and holiness rituals and stuff like that that are not present in the other two sources.
Gotcha. And what would you say to apologists who say, well, no, that's just another aspect of God, of sharing the law versus sharing how he came to be. It's just different information.
Yeah, like Moses just sort of had different modes to his writing.
Different purposes.
Yeah, it's possible. I think it's going to have to come down to Occam's razor.
I was trying to set you up. Well, yeah, you can go that way. I was trying to set you up for the contradictions of the Mount Sinai, which was your next point in the thing. But
okay,
you can go there too.
Yeah, so in order for that to work, you have to kind of also make room for the possibility that Moses is a little bit schizophrenic in the sense that he calls God a certain way here and he calls him a different way there, and he appears to contradict in different stories, and we'll get into some of those examples. You have to accept a lot more other stuff in order for that to work. So I think that's where Occam's razor comes into play here, in that it really seems like it's based on the evidence that it was more likely that 4 hands were in the kitchen.
Gotcha. So, yeah, I think it'll become even more clear when we dig deep into the examples and really understand what the individual traditions look like.
Okay, so the documentary hypothesis in a nutshell, it arises from the following 3 problems. Number 1, stylistic and linguistic differences. We talked about the different uses of the name for God, but there's also things like grammar, vocabulary, syntax, stuff like that. Number 2, you've got stories that show up more than once, or patterns of stories that tend to be duplicated, sometimes triplicates. There are triplets of stories. And then finally, you've got stories that clearly contradict each other. And you have inconsistencies where, again, if you are assuming one author, this author has to make room for a lot of these problems.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's the most compelling argument. If they're contradictory statements, then it is more likely different people saying them.
Yeah. So one good example of
different tellings of the story, maybe.
Yeah. So here's an example where you have different perspectives of not only who God is and how he operates, but also differences in style as well. Little did you know that in Genesis, there are 2 creation accounts, 2 different distinct narratives. One that it focuses more on the 7th day. So its climax is the 7th day. It's the most important moment of that narrative. And the second creation story, its climax centers around the creation of the woman, which is really interesting. On the one hand, in the first account, you've got a God that is distant, that's outside space and time. It sounds like. It lacks a theogony. That means it lacks a story behind where God came from. God's power is his will, and he imposes order in chaos. Where the second story, while they do share the lack of an origin for God himself, which is very unique to Judaism, God's power is different, where he's now utilizing his breath, which resembles, in my opinion, more of a Babylonian tradition, where you read the Enuma Elish, and the God who creates the universe creates it also by speaking it into existence. So there's that ancient superstition of how the gods created the world by speaking it into order. And that's something that we get from that second narrative, not from the first narrative that simply God says, let there be. That's willing it. Here, God is literally breathing it into existence. He takes the soil from the ground and he breathes his breath into it and creates Adam. And finally, he shows concern for human beings, right? He gets the skin and he clothes them and he sends them off. That's not a God that's distant. That's a God that's right there in front of you, right? How do you know that you're naked, right? That kind of God. Where is your brother? What have you done with Abel, right?
Yeah. And I also know that between the two accounts too, I read a contradiction, or there's also a different order of the creation events. One of them being, first account says plants came before humans, and the second story, it says humans came before plants. So it's definitely making more sense if it is from different traditions.
That's right. Something else that's pretty interesting too is not only are there two creation accounts, but there are two flood accounts.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And so when you read through those texts, you'll notice that there are differences in like the number of days that it rains and the stuff that happens. And so scholars have been able to identify between those chapters, those three chapters, Genesis 6 through 9, which verses actually belong to which tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I've done here, and I'm hoping that you all can see it, is, let's see, yeah, you should be able to see it, is each verse, and we're going to read them in, not in a chronological way. We're just going to read each verse from each tradition independently from each other. And if this hypothesis is true, then we should get a clear sense of each individual flood tradition in each reading without repeating verses.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Because part of the hypothesis with regards to the flood is that there were two flood traditions that were mixed into one. So we should be able to identify them.
So what tradition are we about to read first?
I forget which is which, but one is priestly and one is Yahwist.
Okay. I'm sure. Okay. How about we go into this like a mystery? We don't know what it is. Let's read it and see by your description if we can guess which tradition this belongs to.
Gotcha. Yeah. Priestly or Yahwist. All right. What do you say we take turns in each of these passages?
And you can put your vote in the chat.
Okay. Yeah.
what you guess.
All right. Go ahead and read this first chunk here.
All right. This is the account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. So God said to Noah, I'm going to put an end to all the people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I'm surely going to destroy both of them and the earth. So make yourself an ark of cypress wood, make rooms in it, and coat it with pitch inside and out. This is how you're to build it. The ark is to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. Make a roof for it, leaving below the roof an opening 1 cubit high all around. Put a door in the side of the ark and make lower, middle, and upper decks. I'm going to bring floodwaters on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens. Every creature that has the breath of life in it, everything on earth will perish. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. You were to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. 2 of every kind of bird, of every kind of animal, and of every kind of creature that moves along the ground will come with you to be kept alive. You're to take every kind of food that is to be eaten and store it away as food for you and for them. Noah did everything just as God commanded him.
Noah was 600 years old when the flood waters came to the earth.
Pairs of clean and unclean animals. Okay, I'm hearing a little bit of law, I guess. Of birds and all of creatures that move along the ground, male and female, came to Noah and entered the ark as God had commanded Noah.
In the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 7th day of the second month,
17th.
On the 17th day of the second month, on that day, all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened.
On that very day, Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, together with his wife and the wives of his 3 sons, entered the ark. They had with them every wild animal according to its kind, all livestock according to their kind, every creature that moves along the ground according to its kind, and every bird according to its kind, everything with wings. Pairs of all creatures that have the breath of life in them came to Noah and entered the ark. The animals going in were male and female, and every living thing as God had commanded Noah. Then the Lord shut him in.
The waters rose and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the surface of the water. They rose greatly on the earth, and all the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered. The waters rose and covered the mountains to a depth of more than 15 cubits. Every living thing that moved on land perished. Birds, livestock, wild animals, and all the creatures that swarm over the earth, and all mankind.
The waters flooded the earth for 150 days.
But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark. And he sent the wind over the earth, and the waters receded. Now the springs of the deep and the floodgates of the heavens had been closed, and the rain had stopped falling from the sky.
The water receded steadily from the earth. At the end of the 150 days, the water had gone down. And on the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. The waters continued to recede until the 10th month, and on the first day of the 10th month, the tops of the mountains became visible.
And sent out a raven and kept flying back and forth until the water had dried up from the earth.
By the first day of the first month of Noah's 601st year, the water had dried up from the earth. Noah then removed the covering from the ark and saw that the surface of the ground was dry.
By the 27th day of the second month, the earth was completely dry. Then God said to Noah, "Come out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons and their wives. Bring out every kind of living creature that is with you, the birds, the animals, and all the creatures that move along the ground, so they can multiply on the earth and be fruitful and increase in number of it." So Noah came out, together with his sons and his wife and his sons' wives, all the animals and all the creatures that move along the ground and all the birds, everything that moves on land, came out of the ark, one kind after another.
Then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, "Be fruitful, increase in number, and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you will fall on the beasts of the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and every creature that moves along the ground, and on all the fish in the sea. They're given into your hands. Everything that lives and moves about will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, now I give you everything. But you must not eat meat. That has its lifeblood still in it. And for your lifeblood, I will surely demand an accounting. I'll demand an accounting from every animal, and from each human being too. I will demand an accounting for the life of another human being. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made mankind. As for you, be fruitful and increase in number, multiply on the earth and increase upon it. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, I now establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that was with you, the birds and livestock and all the wild animals, all those that came out of the ark with you, every living creature on earth. Establish my covenant with you. I establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of the flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant I am making between me and you and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come. I've set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Where whenever I bring clouds over the earth and the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all living creatures of every kind. Never again will the waters become a flood to destroy all life. Whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures of every kind on earth. So God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant I will establish between me and all of life on the earth.
All right, awesome. I think that was the long version.
Mm-hmm.
And notice how it kept, it was very mindful about days, calendar. It was mindful about things that sounded like law. And so it sounds very much like the priestly tradition.
It was very precise in mentioning exact day, time.
Yeah, exactly. And now we're going to do a second reading. I think it's shorter, but it's a second reading using completely distinct separate verses. We will not be repeating any verses whatsoever. Yet we should get a clear sense of this flood narrative.
Okay.
By the way, did you notice that was there anything that was missing from this narrative? Like if you had read this in church, would people have concluded, wait a minute, is there something missing from this story?
There's nothing that comes to mind.
Yeah, no, nothing really. Everything is there.
All the elements, yeah.
The instructions of building the ark, the thing about the animals, the time that it rained, when the raven, how long it took for the water to stop, the sacrifice at the end, and then the covenant.
Yep.
Pretty much it. Now let's do the second reading. All right, starting in Genesis 6, 5 through 8. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race. I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I've created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I've made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord.
Okay. The Lord then said to Noah, go into the ark, you and your whole family, because I have found you righteous in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of every kind of clean animal, a male and its mate, and 1 of every pair of unclean animal, a male and its mate, and also 7 pairs of every kind of bird, male and female, to keep their various kinds alive throughout the earth. 7 days from now, I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. That's a big difference. And I will wipe from the face of the earth every living creature I've made. And Noah did all that the Lord commanded him.
How many pairs?
7 pairs.
7 pairs. Okay. And Noah and his sons and his wives and his wife and his sons' wives entered the ark to escape the waters of the flood. After
the 7 days, the floodwaters came on the earth.
And rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights.
The animals going in were male and female of every living thing, and God had commanded Noah, as God had commanded Noah. Then the Lord shut him in. For 40 days, the flood kept coming on the earth, and the waters increased. For 40 days, the flood kept coming on the earth, and as the waters increased, they lifted the ark high above the earth.
Everything on dry land that had the breath of life in its nostrils died. The breath of life. Does that sound like one of the creation stories?
Mm-hmm.
Every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out. People and animals and the creatures that moved along the ground and the birds were wiped from the earth. Only Noah was left and those with him in the ark.
Now the springs of the deep and the floodgates of the heavens had been closed, and the rain had stopped falling from the sky. The water receded steadily from the earth. At the end of the 150 days, the water had gone down.
After 40 days, Noah opened the window he had made in the ark.
Then he set out a dove to see if the water had receded from the surface of the ground. But the dove could find nowhere to perch because there was water all over the surface of the earth. So it returned to Noah in the ark. He reached out his hand and took the dove and brought it back to himself in the ark. He waited 7 more days and sent out the dove from the ark. When the dove returned to him in the evening, then there in its beak was a freshly plucked olive leaf. Then Noah knew the water had receded from the earth. He waited 7 more days and sent the dove out again, but this time it did not return to him.
By the first day of the first month of Noah's 601st year, the water had dried up from the earth. Noah then removed the covering from the ark and saw that the surface of the ground was dry.
Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and taking some of all the clean animals and clean birds, he sacrificed burnt offerings on them. The Lord smelled a pleasing aroma and said in his heart, "Never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood. And never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done." So there's a pleasing aroma he's smelling. They mentioned feeling regret before. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease.
That's right. So there you have it, folks. These are each distinct, separate verses within the same book, where if you read them individually, they're both complete narratives of the same flood tradition, only told a little differently. But each one contained the same elements. Even the covenant at the end. In this version, which is the Yahwist tradition, it doesn't quite use the word covenant because that's more of a priestly tradition word, but it does have a promise. And you have God sort of like regretting personally what has happened and promising not to do it again. And so that's essentially the same thing. So isn't that interesting?
It is. It's now that we're looking at it now, it seems so silly that you would think it is one author and that they would retell this same story again and again, because it's has more differences, but it's the same story. So it's like, it's not, there's no need to retell the story. It's not sharing a different perspective or, that just seems unnecessary.
Yeah. It's essentially a doubling of the same myth, the same story, but it came from different regions. And so it's going to carry different styles and different tones and different things with it. And so what the Bible redactors did for us is they meshed them together and did what scholars refer to as seams, which are verses that are clearly just sort of like uniting two separate things together.
They're woven together.
Yeah, it's the work of the tapestry of the rabbis that made all this happen. So,
I mean, I know that for you that makes the Bible more fascinating because it is so complex and it tells more of a story of the history and the different traditions that came together politically to understand that background.
Yeah. Other examples of where things repeat, where you have, in this case, you've got triplets, are stories that relate to the patriarchs. So there's one famous one that relates to Abraham, where in 3 distinct occasions, you've got a scenario where either Abraham, and in the third scenario, it's Isaac, who fears that the beauty of the wife is going to end up where the Pharaoh, or in the case of Isaac, a king, to like rob her and take her from him. And so they, on each occasion, the patriarch lies about how it's his sister and not his wife, so that there's not a problem and he doesn't get in trouble because he fears like they might end up killing him because of how beautiful his wife is.
Huh.
Yeah, so you've got that showing up in Genesis 12 verses 10 to 20, where it happens for the first time in Abraham's life. And in the second time would be in Genesis chapter 20 verses 1 through 16, where that same story happens again with Abraham and Sarah, and Abraham lies about that, and then it's the same ordeal. And then finally, Isaac and Abimelech, who is now a king, Genesis 26, verses 1 through 33. You can read about that story as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of repetition in the stories with noticeable differences.
That's right. Another interesting example of a doublet is the naming of Jacob. So did you know that the Bible has two distinct stories where Jacob's name is changed to Israel?
Really?
Like two different contexts.
So what do the two different stories say?
Yeah, so the first one is Genesis 32, verse 22 to 32, where Jacob wrestles with a messenger or a representative of God. And I wonder if that's the Elohimist tradition at play here. Because in the Elohimist tradition, God has to send a messenger. It can't be just himself. And so he wrestles with this messenger. And at the end of that, God changes Jacob's name to Israel. But then we read that again in Genesis 35, where you have another scenario, another narrative where Jacob also has his name changed to Israel by God, and it's on a separate occasion. Genesis 35, 9 through 15. So why would God have the need to change Jacob's name twice?
Yeah, if it was already changed, why would he need to change it again?
That's right. So that's a bit of a problem there. Genesis 35, 9 through 15. Another great example is the Ten Commandments. So I don't know if you knew, but in the Bible, there are at least two versions of the Ten Commandments. Shows up twice.
So the 10 Commandments aren't even the same? Like there's not the 10 Commandments? It's not a thing, like a set thing?
It's not. It's each list is a little bit unique, but not all too different. First one is in Exodus 20. That's maybe the most popular one. And then the next one shows up in Deuteronomy 5, verses 4 through 21, where I think the order is a little differently, and then maybe one or two of the commandments are a little differently as well.
So you mentioned that the biblical scholars, there's pretty much consensus among the majority of them that this documentary hypothesis is really the source of Genesis specifically. So in summary, what led them to propose that there needs to be an explanation for all of this?
Yeah, so everything we've mentioned now, plus, and there's a lot more. So I thought to make things simple for everyone, I found this beautiful paragraph that summarizes the rest of the problem. And then you guys could decide for yourselves.
Yeah.
How about that? You can find this from contradictionsinthebible.com. It is from an article titled How the Bible Was Discovered to be a Collection of Contradictory Texts. And it reads like this. Quote, the mention of the Philistines in the time of the patriarchs in Genesis 26, we who know from archaeological and extra-biblical records did not actually occupy the land prior to the 12th century BC. Thus, their mention in the time of Abraham is an anachronism. In other words, something that's mentioned out of place, and most likely represents the geopolitical world of the 10th and the 9th centuries BC, when the Philistines played a major role in the politics of Israel. Another commonly mentioned anachronism in Genesis are references to the domesticated camels in Genesis 24. Camels were not domesticated until much later and therefore reflect the historical reality of a later author's time period. Indeed, the mention of the caravan of camels in Joseph's story carrying, quote, gum, balm, and myrrh in Genesis 37:25, highlights products that were part of the Arabian trade that flourished in the 8th and the 7th centuries BC. These are additionally numerous political and religious institutions and even city names throughout the Hexateuch, or the books of Genesis through Joshua, which did not exist in the time of the patriarchs, the wilderness narratives, or the conquest narratives. They are anachronisms and reflect the geopolitical world of a much later time period. The 9th to 8th century BC border between the Israelites and the Philistines, for example, is anachronistically portrayed as a treaty made between Abraham, Isaac, and the Philistine king Abimelech in Genesis 21, verse 30 to 32 and 26, 33 to 33. Likewise, Israel and Aram's 9th and 8th century BC political border is portrayed through the covenant made between Jacob and Laban. As is visible from these two examples, tribal or kin relationships depicted in the book of Genesis often recall the political realities of a much later period, that is, of the author of the text's own time period. The relationship between Jacob and Esau in Genesis 25 and 27, which our narrative informs us are eponyms for Israel and Edom, respectively, reflects the political relationship between Israel and Edom in the 9th and 8th centuries BC, the time in which this narrative was most likely written, and thus aims at explaining the origins of its own historical political circumstances. There are many more anachronisms throughout the Hexateuch, and they have served later generations of biblical scholars and readers as clues to the dates of composition of the text and the traditions that make up its books.
That is a lot more. That's a lot more reasons that wasn't even covered in the beginning, like the timing of it all. So it makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much. I think that brings clarity onto why the stories are so different, and takes away the power on the people who take the text literally.
They call me a god.